Please welcome Father Brian Lucas.
Thanks very much for that generous welcome. Some of those degrees are a bit Mickey Mouse. I was privileged to do my LLB and LLM at Sydney University. It's a particular pleasure, before I get into the paper, a particular pleasure for me to be here this morning. This is the first time I have been in this building. But I was very involved when St Michael's College was on this site, and when the decisions were being taken to demolish St Michael's College and enter into an arrangement with the University of Sydney for the redevelopment of the site. I moved from my role as Finance Officer and Secretary of the Archdiocese of Sydney to Canberra before all that work was done. But it's terrific to see this building, and I hope it's able to be used in the way that you want it to be used. So my capacity here is really as President of the Catholic Historical Society, because the approach was made to us to provide a speaker on this theme of out of the shadows. How do we engage in that with the church and the secular world? I spent 17 years as Cardinal Clancy's media spokesman, and that was my bread and butter work. How do we engage in the marketplace? So I thought one of the historical issues, of course, for the church in engaging in the marketplace is the perceptions people have of the church, and that leads to these issues of sectarianism. So I entitled my paper, Sectarianism Today: Has anti-Catholicism gone aground or gone underground? And that's what we'll try and reflect on for a little while. We'll consider the broad history of sectarianism in Australia since the early settlement, noting in particular the conflicts between Catholics and the Anglican Protestant establishment. We'll consider the changes to that sectarian outlook in recent years, and then canvass the question as to whether there is contemporary evidence of anti-Catholicism in public policy and practice, and what response church authorities should make to that. 10th of April 2014, in the Banco Court of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Dyson Hayden, a former Justice of the High Court of Australia, gave the Acton Lecture on Religion and Freedom. The annual Acton Lecture is presented by the Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society program at the Centre for Independent Studies. That's one of these think tanks. It offers a platform, according to their website, for prominent individuals to reflect on contemporary issues of culture, faith and society as they arise in and confront Australia. Dyson Hayden's topic was this: Catholic resistance to German state persecution, lessons for modern Australia. Towards the end of his learned paper on the way Bismarck and Hitler persecuted Catholics, he made this comment: Now, there may be a new anti-Catholic movement, particularly among intellectuals. To adapt Windhorst's aphorism, anti-Catholicism in Australia might now be called the racism of the intellectuals. We'll come back to consider that comment and some of the reactions to it in more detail, but it opens up our question: has anti-Catholicism come to an end, or has it found a new home? So to situate the question within its historical context, we'll make a few brief comments. The history of sectarianism is very well documented. Michael Hogan's book, The Sectarian Strand, Religion in Australian History, is the authoritative text. And in the interest of time and to give proper attention to our main thesis, just a brief survey. Michael Hogan's doctoral studies concerned the Catholic campaign for state aid in New South Wales, and led him to reflect on the broader question in the way in which Australian society was influenced by class and religion. And then in a subsequent, more recent article, a postscript, Sectarianism to the 21st Century, he considers some of the more recent publications. So the issue for reflection is the extent to which religious rivalry and discrimination affected key institutions, such as political parties, schools, hospitals, universities, as well as employment patterns and social mobility. In 1960, Father Con Duffy, Sydney priest who was the archivist of the Archdiocese of Sydney, wrote an article, and he referred to the question of whether explicit anti-Catholicism still existed. And there was an editorial in the Sydney Morning Herald that made this comment: "Sectarianism is always an ugly thing, and never uglier than in this country where it is a legacy of Ireland's misfortunes." That was the view of the editorial of the Sydney Morning Herald. And then, after referring to various calamities, such as the introductions of foxes and rabbits, the editorial talked about the introduction of orangeism for people. Orangeism being, of course, that Protestant perception which was brought into Australia, according to this editorial, as a calamity much the same as the rabbits and the foxes. And the editorial goes on: "This latter enterprise has been carried out whether by John Smith or John Beelzebub or the Reverend Jones or the Reverend Belfajaw, it matters not. Someone has carried this congenital virus halfway around the world and tainted a young nation." So Duffy, of course, agreed with that sentiment, and he says this: "Such is the situation in Australia today." We're talking, he's writing in 1960. "It is a curse." I was born in 1960. Not many of you here, I don't know. You don't need to own up, Richard, whether you were, but not too many of you were born in 1960. But I was. I was at school in 1960. Anyway, this is what he says: "It is a curse that we know not how to cast off. Apparently, it will always be with us as it always has been. This latter clause draws the subject into the domain of history and justifies a paper on the origins and opposition to the Church in Australia." He then goes on, beginning with the circumstances of the First Fleet, and describes the various elements of contention between Catholics and the Anglican Protestant establishment. Antagonism to the Irish, and remember we've got this confusion of Irish and Catholic, but not all of the Irish were Catholic, just bear that in mind. But the antagonism towards the Irish was largely grounded in the fear of rebellion, which came to fruition in Castle Hill, up in the northwest of Sydney, in 1804. In 1803, Governor King was generous in allowing the convict priest, Father James Dixon, he'd been transported here for crime, but was allowed to practice as a priest. He could minister under stringent conditions as a reward for the good conduct of the Irish convicts. If they behaved themselves, they could go to Mass. Following the rebellion in 1804 at Castle Hill, that permission was withdrawn. The Catholics were disadvantaged in various ways. Baptisms and marriages had to be conducted according to Anglican rites, and Catholic children in colonial orphanages had to be raised as Anglicans. Governor Macquarie's original position was very antagonistic. Duffy writes this: "Governor Macquarie expressed his blunt opinion on permitting or forbidding the exercise of the Catholic religion when he made the following recommendation to the Home authorities in connection with the expulsion of Father O'Flynn. Jeremiah O'Flynn was a wandering priest who wandered into Sydney with no credentials and no permissions and nothing else, caused grief and got thrown out. Nothing can possibly promote or preserve internal peace and tranquility as much as uniformity in matters of religion." In other words, if you want a calm, peaceful society, same religion for everyone. This is what Macquarie is writing to the Home authorities: "I beg leave most earnestly to recommend that no sectarian preacher or teacher be permitted to come hither." But interestingly, Macquarie's position eventually softened. Significant and influential citizens were on record supporting Father John Terry's appeal for the construction of a Catholic chapel. Father Terry came here in 1821. The sympathy was genuine. This is what Duffy writes: "When Father Terry made an appeal for assistance in the erecting of the first church, the more respectable and wealthy Protestants gave liberal assistance to the Catholics, who could muster few large contributions from their own ranks." In other words, the Irish Catholics were all poor, and the Protestant establishment were, some of them, very rich. It's worthwhile recording a few of these names, and those of you from Sydney will recognise some of these names as streets or suburbs that you'll be familiar with. Macquarie, Lieutenant Governor Erskine, the Colonial Secretary Frederick Goulburn, J.T. Campbell, St John Jamieson, Justice Field, John Piper, Darcy Wentworth, Major Druitt, Edward Wollstonecraft, John Oxley. Macquarie then laid the foundation stone for the first St Mary's Chapel. And that's recorded in the lower section of the third historical window in St Mary's Cathedral. If you go into St Mary's Cathedral and you stand in the middle, you've got all the religious windows at the front and you've got the historical windows down both sides. And the third window on the western side is Macquarie laying the foundation stone. When I say the historical window, there's a religious theme at the top and the little panel at the bottom is an historical theme. Interestingly, if you go across to the eastern side and have a very close look, you will see some of those windows have been put in the wrong place. If you get the chance, go there and puzzle over which windows should have been put where they should have been put, because they're in the wrong place. So, Macquarie lays the foundation stone for the first St Mary's Chapel. And Macquarie said that he'd found the Catholics to be loyal and faithful subjects of the Crown. Following Macquarie, Governor Burke was very generous in his relationship with Catholics, and the Cambridge History of Christianity presents this opinion. In his Church Act of 1836, the Governor of New South Wales, Richard Burke, offered state aid to the major denominations to assist them in building churches and paying the stipends of their ministers. This act was duplicated in other Australian colonies with far-reaching effect. They effectively bankrolled sectarian rivalry, which is to become a major theme in Australian religious and social history. The other side of that coin, however, is that the colonial populations were very well supplied with religious services and pastoral care, with typically 4 churches, Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian and Methodist, being built in even small towns, all of about the same value and therefore prestige, because they were done with government money, and often on opposite street corners near the centre of town. And if you go to some country towns around Australia, you will find the Catholics on one corner, the Anglicans on the other, Presbyterians on another, built with, and big old, lovely stone churches built with government money. Land grants were a source of tension, and the Catholics sometimes felt cheated that the Anglicans got a better deal and were given better sites. The Anglicans were given most of Glebe, a fair bit of Edgecliff, and of course some property around this university. As it happened, the grant of land at the Sydney seaside suburb of Manly, where St Patrick's Seminary was built, was thought at the time to be of little value, so far out of the way, desolate, and in fact it was presented as a way in which they could keep the people of Manly in the village away from the smallpox on the quarantine station at North Head. But as time has developed, it's now a very, very valuable asset for the Archdiocese. The main source of tension was dispute over the Education Act. And when Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, introduced his Public Education Act in 1830, he withdrew state aid from denominational schools. The idea was that all schools would be free and secular, and that was Parkes' vision. The bishops did not think that was a good idea. So the religious orders rose to the challenge and supported a separate school system without state aid. Sisters of St Joseph with St Mary MacKillop, at the time of her death in 1909, had 1,000 members. And this was the generosity of people rising to the occasion. And of course, many other orders arrived, particularly with a commitment to education, including the Dominicans were part of that story. So, by 1901, there were 100,000 pupils in Catholic schools. The heroic campaign to staff those schools and continue those schools, of course, intensified Catholic identity, which was then compounded with Irish anti-British feeling, and that helped galvanise this sectarian divide between Catholic and Protestant. Catholic system remains separate, and even today is sometimes a cause of tension. You will see articles and letters to the editor in the paper complaining about private schools. But probably the high point of anti-Catholic sectarianism was the conscription controversy at the time of the Great War and its aftermath in 1920s. During the Great War, conscription referendums in Australia exacerbated the existing sectarian divisions between Catholics and Protestants, with Catholics, generally working class and of Irish descent, being opposed to conscription. That's the compulsory call up to the military. Again, none of you would remember what it was like in the early 1970s, late 1960s, when we all registered, I did, for national service. There was the call-up. They had a ballot. And depending on your birthday, you got called up or you didn't get called up. So, I was in the ballot but didn't get called up. Some lotteries you win, some lotteries you don't win. It depends on whether you think it was a win or a loss. There were a lot of advantages of being called up if you're a university student, because they would defer your call up till you graduated, then you go in as a graduate and you go into some nice office job on seriously good money, and things could have turned out well. Who knows? That's sorry for that distraction. So you've got the Protestants in favour of conscription, backing the government, and the Catholics by and large against it. Prime Minister William Hughes was the leader of the Yes campaign. Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne was very outspoken in favour of the No campaign, and so they had these referendums. And the referendum on the 28th of October 1916 had 1,160,000 citizens voted no, and 1,087,000 citizens voted yes, so the referendum was lost. Mannix biographer Neil Brennan comments, "The reaction to the vote was as sharp and as ill-tempered as the campaign had been. Large numbers of Catholics desperately seeking acceptance in a mildly hostile society might have voted yes, had not Dr. Mannix given his prestige to their political faith." And another example of the way in which sectarianism was played out in the 1920s was the scandal relating to Sister Liguri. Have any of you heard of Sister Liguri? Sister Liguri was a nun in Wagga. And the Loyal Orange Institution were part of the conspiracy, it was alleged, concerning her departure from the Mount Erin convent in Wagga. They protected her when she allegedly ran away from the convent. And I say allegedly, there's a lot of complexity about why she left the convent and the circumstances in which she left the convent. And a Sydney barrister, Jeff Kilday, who was a classmate of mine at this university, has written a wonderful book, Sister Liguri, the Nun Who Divided the Nation. And he's spoken, I think, to the Thomas More Society and certainly spoken to the Catholic Historical Society. He concludes, Dr. Kilday concludes, "The affair is arguably one of the most significant events in the history of religious sectarianism in Australia." So, Sister Liguri leaves the convent, the Loyal Orange Institution, these are the Protestant establishment protector and hider, and there's a big court case over it, and it was a cause of great scandal. Now, one church response to the sectarianism of that time was in 1919, the foundation in Sydney of the Knights of the Southern Cross. It was really a counter to the influence of the Masonic lodges and was particularly instrumental in assisting Catholics to find employment. In other words, if you were a member of the Knights of the Southern Cross, you would give priority and bias to young Catholic people who came for a job. During the Second World War then, however, things started to soften. Soldiers of various denominations fought alongside each other with mutual respect, and in the years following up to the Second Vatican Council in 1962 saw a softening but not the elimination of that sectarian issue. But a number of other factors were relevant. Demographic, social, economic and political changes contributed to those weakening of those tensions. The 1953 Eucharistic Congress had the potential to revive sectarian charges that the Catholics were more Roman than Australian and were seeking undue influence in Australian society. The idea of processions of the Blessed Sacrament through the streets of Sydney were thought perhaps to be going to cause great controversy. However, there was some criticism, but by and large it was fairly muted, with Protestants saying, well, the Catholics have some right to give public witness to their beliefs. The other critical factor was the migration from Southern Europe after the war, which increased the Catholic population and weakened the Protestant dominance. Marcia Roach has written a very interesting paper on all of this, emphasising this change of ethnicity. She writes this: "The increasing post-war ethnic diversity and concomitant increase of non-Christian faith traditions in Australian society was an important factor in altering the existing British-Irish demographic basis underlying sectarianism. The immediate post-war ethnic diversity, consisting of mainly European Christian immigrants, became even more diverse as the White Australia policy was gradually dismantled and finally abolished in 1973. The most significant factor, though, in breaking down sectarianism was, of course, the Second Vatican Council and its emphasis on ecumenical dialogue. The ecumenical movement had its roots in Edinburgh in the World Missionary Conference in 1910, so it wasn't something the Second Vatican Council had invented. And various Catholic theologians were very involved in these questions of dialogue and relationship with non-Catholic communities. But from the premise that the Catholic Church was the one true church, we had the phenomenon of Catholics being prohibited from participating in Anglican Protestant worship. I have the memory as a little boy, a neighbour in our street was getting married in the Anglican church at Summerhill, beautiful Anglican church there, St Andrews at Summerhill with a beautiful spire. And my mother wanted to show some solidarity with this Protestant neighbour who was getting married and took me, a little kid, walking down, and we stood on the footpath outside the church because you weren't allowed to go in. That was the mindset of the time. John the 23rd, at the conclusion of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity in 1959, announced the Second Vatican Council. But I think in parallel with the softening of the Church's position on its relations with other Christian denominations was a growing confidence within the Catholic community of its place in society. And of course, one of the examples of that is most documented is the famous Goulburn school strike, 1963. I have the memory of it. It was very much talked about in the news. What happened was the government said to the Catholic school authorities in Goulburn, your toilets in the school do not come up to standard. You have to repair and rebuild the toilets. And the authorities in Goulburn, led by Bishop Cullinane, who was the auxiliary bishop of the Canberra-Goulburn Archdiocese, said, we don't have the money to rebuild the toilets. You want us to rebuild the toilets, you give us the money. Government said no, so they said that's fine. They shut up shop, and on the Monday morning all the little children in Goulburn, more than 1,000 of them, marched down to the public school to enrol. And of course the public school had no hope. There were about 3 or 4 schools in Goulburn, had no hope of being able to enrol them all, and that created a great a scandal, which led, of course, eventually then to the process of government funding for Catholic schools on the premise the Catholics pay taxes, why shouldn't they get a share of their tax money for their schools? The remnants of the employment policy for some businesses not to hire Catholics still lingered into the 1970s. I was participating, I was a law student looking for a position as an article clerk with a law firm. Then the interviewer realised I'd attended a Catholic school. The screening process wasn't good enough and I'd slipped through it accidentally. And he politely but very firmly apologised that I'd accidentally slipped through the screening system, but they couldn't offer me a position as an article clerk because it was the firm, that law firm's policy, not to employ Catholics. You could almost laugh at that. But I must say at the time I wasn't particularly disturbed. I didn't feel offended at all, because there are other legal firms in Sydney that had a policy of only employing Catholics. You couldn't get into Murphy and Maloney if you weren't Catholic, and that was the way it was. But of course by the end of that decade, that overt sectarianism had largely disappeared. Which brings me now to consider the question of whether anti-Catholicism still exists in a more covert fashion. And so I come to the comments again of Dyson Hayden. He made this comment in his ACTA lecture. Until about the 1960s, Australian society was marked by sectarianism. It took several forms. For example, particularly in country towns, Catholics were derisively referred to in non-Catholic circles. Perhaps the opposite position also prevailed. Professional firms were to some extent organised along sectarian lines. Catholic firms employed Catholics and no one else. Presbyterian firms employed Presbyterians and no one else. And Catholics were not easily employable in other non-Catholic firms. There were ads in the paper, Catholics need not apply. In due course, all that changed. The Federation began with a great judge who was a Catholic, Mr Justice O'Connor. But there have been very few Catholic judges in New South Wales before the McGurk government came into office in 1941. Since then, this is what Dyson Heydon is saying, since then there have been many, including the great Sir Cyril Walsh. If any of you are connected to St John's College at this university, you will see the portrait of Sir Cyril Walsh in the, I think, the entrance vestibule. I was a little boy, older boy at Summerhill Parish, St Patrick's Summerhill, and Justice Cyril Walsh was a daily mass goer in that parish. At that stage, when I knew him, we all knew him as Judge Walsh. He was a very tall man. He was about 6'4", and he came to mass every day. When I was an older boy, we're talking the 1960s, and we all just knew Judge Walsh. He ended up then as a Justice of the High Court of Australia. He took the University Medal here, I think, in Latin and Law. Is that correct? I think it was Latin and Law. He took the University Medal. But then took ill and was not on the High Court very long and died, I think, at a premature age. Anyway, he then made that comment about anti-Catholicism that I read before, and that created a revolt. These comments of Dyson Heydon in their Sanctum lecture. Jonathan Holmes, you might remember that name, a journalist, on the 2nd of September in the Sydney Morning Herald, said there was no evidence of media prejudice against Catholicism, and the claims that Fairfax and the ABC are picking on the Catholic Church, he said, are baffling. He was referring to a speech by Senator George Brandis, who also commented on the comments of Dyson Heydon. It is shocking and unacceptable that the nation's senior law officer should be accusing two of its main media organisations of conducting a systematic campaign against religious freedom, and that one of its most respected former High Court judges should be hurling around phrases such as the racism of the intellectuals, both without offering a skerrick of evidence or justification. Now, what Dyson Heydon was talking about was revealed in a book, an American book by Philip Jenkins called The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice. And I'll just quickly read a review that summarises his book. He says, anti-Catholicism has a long history in America, and as Philip Jenkins argues in The New Anti-Catholicism, this virulent strand of hatred, once thought dead, is alive and well in our nation, but few people seem to notice or care. A statement that is seen as racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic or homophobic can haunt a speaker for years, writes Jenkins. But it is still possible to make hostile and vituperative public statements about Roman Catholicism without fear of serious repercussions. Jenkins shines a light on anti-Catholic sentiment in American society and illuminates its causes, looking closely at gay and feminist anti-Catholicism, anti-Catholic rhetoric and imagery in the media, and the anti-Catholicism of the academic world. For newspapers and news magazines, for television news and in movies, for major book publishers, the Catholic Church has come to provide a grossly stereotyped public villain. Catholic opinions, doctrines and individual leaders are frequently the butt of harsh satire. Indeed, the notion that the Church is a deadly enemy of women, the idea of Catholic misogyny, is commonly accepted in the news media and popular culture. And the recent pedophile priest scandal, he shows, has revived many ancient anti-Catholic stereotypes. It was said that with the election of John F. Kennedy, anti-Catholicism in America was dead. This provocative new book corrects that illusion, drawing attention to this important issue. Now, there are various examples we might cite of antagonism to the Catholic Church, whether deserved or not. The media attention to the Church during the Royal Commission on Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has to be named. It's not opportune on this occasion to delve into the intricacies of the strategy the Royal Commission had employed, but and Father Frank Brennan. But another example we might consider relating to an anti-Catholic approach to public policy is the way in which some present the serious and important public policy question of end-of-life care. At one extreme, it's referred to as euthanasia, and then more politely, at the other extreme, it's now called voluntary assisted dying. And it's presented in a way that seeks to present those who take a position against such public policy as being religious bigots, whose prejudice and irrational perspective is inflicting harm on others and ought not be accepted. And of course, Catholic allegiance to those who might hold such a view is explicitly mentioned. You don't have to be Catholic to take a view against those approaches to end-of-life care, but it is frequently the case that if you can associate that controversy with a Catholic, you've already started the debate. We saw, and probably none of you will remember, the Northern Territory debate, and Cardinal Clancy and the bishops took a very explicit decision during that debate to keep out of it and let that debate be fought by the doctors and the lawyers. And that was somewhat successful. More recently, the more the church gets involved in that debate, the more you set up the straw man that you knock down. Anyway, long-standing controversies relating to anti-discrimination law and the concerted campaigns to remove the right of religious schools to employ staff who are supportive of the ethos of the school is another covert attack on people of faith, and Catholics in particular, since their schools are more numerically dominant. And of course the irrationality of that approach is easily understood. Just ponder whether the organisation that runs the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras would employ a person who had published comments attacking same-sex relationships. Another interesting example of the major shift now in perception of religious conflict was this analysis relating to the relationship of the Catholic Church and Islam. This is a statement made by Ali Manmouri, how Pope Francis transformed Vatican's legacy in the Muslim world. Just let me read what he said. The departure of Pope Francis marks a significant loss not only to Christianity but also the Islamic world. The late head of the Catholic Church leaves behind a powerful legacy of coexistence and interfaith dialogue, having taken bold and unprecedented steps to build bridges with Muslim communities. And I think it's important to note the recent comments of Pope Leo relating to relationships with Christian orthodoxy. He recently received members of a delegation from the Eastern Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch on June the 28th, a few weeks ago at the Apostolic Palace, in the context of the June 29 celebration of the feasts of St. Peter and Paul. And he stated that his intention is to persevere in the effort to re-establish full visible communion between our churches, a goal, he said, that can only be achieved with God's help through continual commitment to respectful listening and fraternal dialogue. So how might then we conclude this survey of sectarianism and answer the question we posed at the beginning? Is there still evidence of anti-Catholic sentiment in contemporary Australia? Well, the way you find the answer to that these days is artificial intelligence. And this is what ChatGPT had to say. I admire your mirth, because no doubt you are all victims of this new phenomenon that won't let you write essays at universities anymore. I'm teaching a course at the moment for the University of Notre Dame and the Catholic Institute on church administration, which is my area. And we're not doing any essays, we're doing exams. Which is what I used to do at the university. You had a whole year, 3 hours a week of lectures, textbook that thick, and 1 3¼ hour exam at the end, That was all there was. So anyway, that's another story. But let me just read what ChatGPT had to say, because it's actually not too bad. In contemporary times, anti-Catholic prejudice has persisted in various forms, including in the media. Sometimes portrayals of the Catholic Church can be highly negative, especially when it comes to sensitive issues such as sexual abuse scandals or the Church's stand on issues like contraception, divorce and LGBTQ+ rights. While these are valid concerns, some critics of Catholicism use such controversies to perpetuate broader negative stereotypes of Catholicism and the Church. For example, films and television shows have occasionally portrayed Catholic priests as villains or perpetrators of abuse. While the sexual abuse crisis within the Church has been widely condemned and warrants attention and reform, it is important to distinguish between addressing legitimate grievances and unfairly stereotyping or demonising all members of the Church based on the actions of few individuals. So far so good. This is ChatGPT. Anti-Catholic sentiment has deep historical roots shaped by religious conflict, political struggles and social issues. From the Protestant Reformation to debates over modernity and the Church's influence in the 21st century, Catholicism has often been at the centre of ideological and cultural tensions. While some criticisms of the Church are rooted in legitimate concerns, such as the need for reform and accountability, others are driven by long-standing prejudices and misconceptions. You can see the weakness now of ChatGPT, it's just repeating what's already said. Today, debates surrounding Catholicism continue to evolve, reflecting broader social changes and the Church's ongoing role in shaping cultural and moral discussions. Understanding these debates in context is essential for fostering dialogue and understanding between Catholics and those who hold different views. So, not too bad a summary. So if we accept the view, though, that there are still certain undercurrents of irrational prejudice, so that matters of public policy are no longer debated on their merits, and opponents of culturally accepted views are scapegoated, then we have to move on to our final question. How should the Church respond? Timidity is always a danger because it's very uncomfortable to be the centre of strident criticism. And yet there is a powerful text of the Gospel in Matthew 10:22. And you'll be hated by all because of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. So the way in which the Church then responds, of course, will be largely determined by particular issues, but this is where I become provocative, and I want to throw out a few thoughts for your reflection. There's always been a tendency for the Church to be very confident in the truth of its position and to seek to propagate its position from that perspective and use the power of intellectual argument. Well, I'm being particularly provocative in the presence of two scholarly Dominicans. But the Church has traditionally been a religion of scholarship. We've got a library. We are good at books. We are good at words. That's been the history of the Catholic intellectual tradition. But it doesn't always work. The logic of the Church position, for example, on the value of human life from conception to natural death, might be impeccable. But in jurisdictions in Australia and around the world, governments have taken a different view in supporting VAD. And can I just give an example of how paper thin some of these intellectual distinctions can be? Person with motor neurone disease struggling in the last weeks of life, struggling to breathe, unable to swallow, is perfectly entitled to say to the doctors, no more. I'll let nature take its course. I don't want any more treatment. Just let me quietly fade away. And that will take then, once you stop eating and drinking, it will take, any medical students here, it will take, a week maybe to quietly fade away. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly proper moral position to take. I don't need any more treatment. I'm not required to have any further treatment. I will let nature take its course. Fair point. Paper-thin distinction between that and instead of taking a week to die, taking a couple of hours to die when you take the medication that is prescribed. Paper-thin distinction that turns on the intention. Two different intentions. But you can see from the point of view of a secular world that's not too intellectual, this is a paper-thin distinction, and of course you can understand why sentiment runs the way sentiment runs. I just use that as an example. So, can I offer you these words of John Henry Newman, who is a model for all scholars? His wonderful book, The Idea of University, and all his other writings. The heart is commonly reached not through reason, but through the imagination. Persons influence us, voices melt us, deeds inflame us. Logic makes a sorry rhetoric with the multitude. Man is not just a reasoning animal. He is a seeing, feeling, contemplating, acting animal. So in prosecuting then the Church's position on matters of public policy, I think the first step is to establish the right relationships. This involves dialogue, showing respect for the other, and being prepared where necessary to find common ground in the interest of the common good. And I think the model of the ecumenical dialogue can help. That's emphasised commonalities rather than differences in belief and practice. Barriers have been broken down, bridges built. Catholics and non-Catholics alike have been released from the mutually harmful effects of the sectarian strife that marred Australia and Australian society for much of its existence. So perhaps instead of trying to prosecute our point of view just with the vigour of intellect, the vigour of intellect has its place, but it is not the only strategy. We need to think about how we melt the hearts of those who are opposed to us by establishing those healthy and proper relationships. And my friends, that is a work in progress. Thank you.